In the early months of 2025, while the world was looking elsewhere, a document was signed behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace. There was no fanfare, no televised address, and certainly no press conference. The palace, in its characteristically understated way, called it routine. But here's what I've learned after covering this institution for years. When a king signs a constitutional order quietly, and the only word the palace offers is routine, that is the word you pull on. Because routine things don't need to be called routine, they just happen. This order does three things that the palace did not want debated publicly. It reshapes who can legally act for the king. It diminishes the standing of specific family members without requiring a parliamentary vote. And it builds legal protections around Queen Camilla that may outlast Charles himself. To understand why any of that matters, you need to understand a term most people have never heard: Councillors of State. In the British constitutional framework, Councillors of State are the monarchy's backup system. When the king is incapacitated or abroad, these individuals, typically the next 4 adults in the line of succession, plus the queen consort, have the legal authority to sign documents, appoint ministers, and keep the crown functioning. This is not a ceremonial role. These people can exercise real sovereign power. Changing how this system works is not a paperwork update. It is constitutional surgery. It requires justification. And Charles just performed it without ever explaining why. February 2024. That is when the clock started. When King Charles announced his cancer diagnosis, the public saw a health story. What was happening inside the palace was something else entirely: a political and legal emergency. The moment that diagnosis was made public, the institution's lawyers began a quiet review. The question they were answering was not medical, it was structural. Who steps in if the king cannot function? And more specifically, who do we need to make sure cannot step in? Because here is the problem the palace faced. Under the existing framework, 2 names remained on the Councillors of State list that the institution had spent years trying to quietly distance itself from: Prince Harry and Prince Andrew. Harry had been living in California since 2020. Andrew had been stripped of his military titles and public duties following the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. Neither was performing any royal function, but constitutionally, both retained the theoretical capacity to act for the king. A formal act of parliament to remove them would have forced a public debate the palace did not want. Questions about the republic, questions about Charles's prognosis, questions about Andrew's disgrace being codified into law. The palace calculated that the reputational cost of a parliamentary process was too high. The emergency order was the solution. By framing the change as a procedural update rather than a targeted exclusion, Charles's team was able to accomplish through a quiet signature what would have taken months of damaging public debate to achieve through Parliament. It was a legally sound, politically elegant maneuver, and it worked precisely because nobody looked closely enough to challenge it. You might assume that an order this significant would have been a joint decision between the King and the Prince of Wales. The available evidence suggests otherwise. Since Princess Catherine's cancer diagnosis and treatment in 2024, William has been running what can only be described as a parallel operation. His office has increasingly made decisions independently. His public schedule reflects his own priorities rather than coordinated palace messaging, and his approach to the media has diverged noticeably from the king's team. He is not simply the heir apparent. He is already behaving like the king in waiting. That growing independence appears to be at the heart of the tension here. Multiple royal commentators and insiders who have spoken to the press have noted that William was not brought into the room when the specifics of this order were being decided. That is a deliberate choice, not an oversight. You do not accidentally exclude the future king from a constitutional decision. There are 3 plausible readings of why Charles made that call. And I want to be clear that these are analytical interpretations, not confirmed reporting. The first, Charles wanted to lock in decisions that reflect his own vision for the monarchy's future before William's different instincts take hold. The second, the order contains provisions specifically designed to protect Camilla's long-term position, provisions that William might have pushed back against. The third, Harry's permanent structural exclusion was something Charles needed to finalize on his own terms, suspecting that William might have left the door fractionally more open. Whatever the motivation, the consequence is the same. Charles is writing the operational rules for the next reign, while the next king is not in the room. Some of what he is writing will be very difficult to reverse. A future King William V can repeal some of this. He cannot repeal all of it without considerable political cost. While the legal review was underway inside the palace, something was happening outside it that deserves attention. Ray Mill House, Camilla's private home in Wiltshire, a property she maintained for over 2 decades, including through her marriage to Charles, was sold. That property was not just real estate. For Camilla, Ray Mill House represented something specific, a life that was entirely her own. She kept it through the years of public hostility following Diana's death. She kept it through the wedding to Charles. She kept it through her elevation to Queen Consort and then Queen. The fact that she held on to it for so long told you something about how she understood her own position inside the institution. The sale, timed as it is against the backdrop of the internal legal review, invites a question worth sitting with. Is this a woman who has finally settled completely into the crown, so secure in her position that she no longer needs a personal exit? Or is this a woman who, understanding that her security is about to depend entirely on legal frameworks rather than a private fallback, is converting a physical asset into a more liquid financial position before the reign changes? I want to be transparent. I cannot tell you definitively which of those readings is correct. What I can tell you is that in the context of everything else happening simultaneously, the legal review, the order, the internal repositioning, the timing of that sale is not something I am willing to dismiss as coincidence. Here is what we know for certain. When Charles dies, William will inherit enormous discretion over Camilla's life: residence, title, funding, public role. The emergency order, to the extent that it codifies Camilla's protections into the constitutional framework rather than leaving them to royal custom, reduces William's future discretion. Whether that was a primary goal of the order or a secondary benefit, it is a real and significant outcome. Pull back from the individual moves and look at the pattern. Since February 2024, the following has happened. The Councillors of State framework was restructured. Harry's status shifted from an ambiguous holding position to something much closer to permanent structural exclusion. Andrew's already diminished standing was further codified, and the legal protections around Camilla's position were reinforced at the constitutional level. None of these moves are accidental. None of them are routine. Each one closes a specific vulnerability. Together, they form something that looks less like crisis management and more like deliberate architecture. Charles is not simply reacting to his diagnosis. He is using the institutional authority of his remaining reign to shape the conditions under which his successor will govern. This is something monarchs have always done, but rarely so methodically, and rarely with so much at stake in terms of family dynamics. What makes this moment unusual is the specific people involved. The vulnerabilities Charles is closing are not abstract constitutional weaknesses. They are Harry. They are Andrew. They are the question of what Camilla's life looks like in 20 years. These are personal. And the fact that Charles is addressing personal vulnerabilities through constitutional mechanisms is itself a signal of how seriously he is taking the transition. William and Catherine remain entirely secure. Nothing in this order diminishes their position or their path to the throne. But the order does communicate something to William. The current king's vision for what the monarchy looks like on the day of the transition is not subject to negotiation. Charles is handing William a crown, but he is also handing him a set of instructions. The palace called this routine. The press, for the most part, accepted that framing. No member of parliament called for a debate. No select committee requested a briefing. The order passed into the constitutional record without a single public challenge. That silence is worth noting. It suggests that the British establishment, the political class, the senior press, the civil service, has made a collective judgment that Charles is doing what needs to be done, and that scrutinizing it publicly would cost more than it gains. Whether you find that reassuring or troubling probably depends on how much trust you place in the institution itself. Looking forward, if Charles's health continues to fluctuate, this order becomes the mechanism that keeps the crown stable. The people who might previously have been called upon, Harry, Andrew, are now structurally sidelined. The people Charles trusts are in place. The protections he wanted are locked in. When William becomes king, he will inherit a monarchy that has been quietly reorganized by his father. Some of what Charles has done is reversible with political will. Some of it is not. The legal architecture of a reign does not disappear when the reign ends. And that brings us to the question I cannot answer for you, because I genuinely do not think there is a clean answer. Is this a king who looked at a fractured family, a contested succession, and a monarchy facing genuine long-term pressure, and did what any responsible head of state would do to protect the institution he has spent his entire life serving? Or is this a king who, facing his own mortality, used the full weight of constitutional authority to protect the people he loves and sideline the people who hurt him, and called it routine so nobody would look too closely? The palace has given us their answer. They said it was routine. I'll let you decide whether you believe them. If this video made you think differently about what's happening inside the palace, share it with someone who follows the royals, because this story is not getting the attention it deserves. If you want to go deeper on the tension between William and the rest of the family, our video on the Wales independence strategy covers exactly that. The link is on screen now. Subscribe if you haven't already. I'm Crown Gaze, and I'll see you in the next one.